Hello, everyone. On today's podcast episode, I'm going to continue talking about atheists and the existence of God and why, you shouldn't really listen to atheists because they have a vested interest to lie to you. It's, telling the truth to an atheist, especially the more famous ones, kicks themselves in the foot. It's like kicking themselves in the foot because, it's easy to prove when something exists, right? It's easy to prove that it exists, right? And it's impossible to prove that it doesn't exist, right? Most you'll believe me that the basic logic. If something exists, it'll be easier to prove that it exists than it is to prove that it doesn't exist. And if it's something near you, something you can see, it's easy to prove that it exists and impossible to prove that it doesn't exist, right? So, and that's the problem with atheism, is that it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. So that already tells you that, there's a high likelihood that God exists. Just for the fact alone that, it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. That should tell you that God, exists. And since I told you before, when something exists, it's easy to prove that it exists. Here's an easy proof that God exists. It's simple, right? In the quantum world, the quantum scientists, right? Quantum physicists say that, the world around us knows when we're watching it, right? The rules of this world only works when we're watching it. That's what they say. It's their words alone. That the world only works when we're watching it. When we're not watching it, the world goes into like a limbo state where all possibilities exist, right? So the world knows when we're watching it. Doesn't that inherently tell you that the world, is intelligent? The world is intelligent enough to know that, to know when we're watching it and when we're not watching it. The very fabric of reality knows when we're watching it and when we're not watching it. And it is intelligent by default. For something to know when it's being watched, for something to know when it's being watched, it means there's an inherent intelligence to it. So the world around us has an inherent intelligence to it. And since the world around us is, omnipresent and intelligent at the same time, the world around us is what? God. Because the God of the Bible is omnipresent and intelligent. It is that easy to prove that God exists. The more scientists study the world, the more they'll prove that God exists by default. Why? Because God exists. And because God exists, it is impossible for atheists to prove that God doesn't exist. And that's the problem that atheists have, is that because God exists, it is very easy to prove that God exists, and it is impossible to prove that it doesn't. So that's why I always say that, atheists are illogical. It's illogical to believe that God doesn't exist without proof. You still need proof to believe something. Many atheists will tell you, that, atheism is a lack of choice. That's an illogical answer. Because theists can say the same thing as well. Theism is the lack of choice as well. We lack the choice. We lack the belief that God doesn't exist. Atheism says they like to believe that God exists. While theists like to believe that God doesn't exist. Yes, we can like that belief as well. So how come you guys can get away with saying that very same word while theists can't? You understand? And you have to look at more, about their logic. The logic falls apart. The reason why atheists believe that God doesn't exist falls apart the moment they open their mouth, because they always give you illogical reasons why they believe that God doesn't exist. Because there's no logical reason to believe that God, doesn't exist. And especially when it's so easy to prove that God exists. The God of the Bible is an intelligent being, and it is omnipresent. The world around us, by the very definition of quantum physicists, quantum scientists, is intelligent by default because it knows when it's being watched or not. The very laws of our world only works when we're watching it, when it's being observed by an observer. The world around us only works when it's being observed by an observer. Otherwise, it goes into a state where all possibilities exist. Just like God. That is the very definition of God itself. He's omnipresent and all-powerful and the creator of everything. Meaning the very world itself creates our reality when we're watching it. When we're not watching it, all possibilities exist. And that's what the Bible states itself. God creates this world for humans, for us. And God is omnipresent. So everyone exists within God. By default, since God is omnipresent, everyone exists within God, just like we all exist within this world we live in. And so if we all exist within God, and likewise, the Bible says we all exist within God, and in reality, we all exist within this world that's intelligent. Doesn't that automatically mean that God and the world around us is the same thing? It's so easy to prove that God exists, but you can only prove it to people who are logical. Illogical people will never understand logic, and that's the problem with atheism, is that because they illogically believe that God doesn't exist. No matter how many logical evidence you bring, you'll never be able to prove that God does. You never be able to. They'll never be able to understand you, because they'll never be able to understand you. You're talking to a brick wall. No matter how logical you are, that's why there's still atheists till today. Do you know how many theologians have probably proven that God exists in many other ways? Because God exists, it's easy to prove that He exists. The only reason why someone is an atheist isn't because there's a logical reason why. Because there's no logical reason why, like I said before, they'll tell you they can't prove that God doesn't exist. Meaning there's no logical reason to believe that God doesn't exist. None. Not a single one. Since there's no logical reason to believe that God doesn't exist, then the only reason why they still believe that God doesn't exist, right, is an illogical one. And it's hard to convince an illogical person using logic. And that's the problem. And the other problem with atheism is that think things through from the point of view of an atheist, right? I've said this before, but I've only touched on it. Think things through from the point of view of an atheist. From the point of view of an atheist, right? If they spend their entire life telling everyone that God doesn't exist, right? And, a random theologist or scientist just comes to their doorstep and just, gives them a definite proof that God exists, what do you think they'll do? Do you think they say, hey, I finally found the proof that God exists? Or do you think that, they'll get angry over it? Likely they'll be mad over it. They'll be uncomfortable, with that fact. Do you know why? They'll be uncomfortable with the fact that God exists because, there's a conflict of interest. If they spend their entire life telling everyone that God doesn't exist, right? Illogically telling everyone that God doesn't exist, and someone comes to the doorstep and brings definite proof, what do you think will happen? All the people around them will start mocking them. They'll be insulted for telling everyone for years that God doesn't exist. If you spent your entire life lying to people and the truth comes out, what do you try to do? You try to bury it. You try to bury the truth as much as possible because you're afraid of what people will do to you. You're afraid of what people will say about you if they ever find out that you've been lying to them all this time. And that's the conflict of interest that atheists have. Because they spend their entire life believing that God doesn't exist. They spend their entire life telling everybody that God doesn't exist. Some people have only been atheists for a few years, So, but still, even 1 year is enough. You spent 1 year telling everyone around you, your friends and family, that God doesn't exist. And then someone comes and proves it. What do you think will happen? They'll start to mock you. They'll start to insult you. And if you're a public person, public figure, you spent your life telling countless people that God doesn't exist. You spent, the higher you are, the harder you fall. So why would a atheist, a renowned atheist, ever agree that God doesn't exist? That God exists? Why would they agree that God exists when the very acknowledgement of that will ruin their reputation? If they ever acknowledge publicly that God exists, It'll ruin their reputation. It'll make them look bad in front of others. It'll make people mock them. It'll make people send death threats to their doorsteps. It'll make people look down on them. You know, they could lose their jobs. They could go home. They could become homeless. And a lot of bad things could happen to them just for the fact that God exists alone. If any theology brings proof that God exists in front of an atheist, you're going to the wrong doorstep. An atheist has already made up their mind. They've already illogically made up their mind a long time ago, and have told their friends and family members that God doesn't exist. Since they've already made up their mind, the moment proof comes, no matter how logical it is, it is not in the best interest to acknowledge that proof. They will never, acknowledge the proof because it could ruin their reputation. It proves they're lying. No one wants to be seen as a liar in front of everyone else. No one wants to be seen as a fool in front of everyone else. No one wants to be seen as an illogical idiot in front of everyone else. Because of that, they will try every means possible to bury the truth. They'll try every means possible, mocking, insulting, gaslighting. They use every fallacy they can possibly find. They use words that makes no logical sense. They use arguments that make no logical sense. They'll try every way possible to bury that truth, to make the person that's telling the truth look like an idiot in front of others. They'll try to insult the person. They'll try to mock the person. They'll try to say the person is an idiot. They'll say everything possible to ruin the reputation of the person who brought the evidence. Why? Because they don't want people to know that God exists. If people know that God exists, it'll ruin their lives. It could possibly ruin their lives. There are people in this world, who they've told that God exists in the past, right? Who've changed their lives, and then, start doing wicked things and evil things. And then, the person that comes out, the atheist that comes out and tells them that God exists again, So following the atheist, they decide to believe that God doesn't exist. And now, now there's proof that God exists. What do you think the atheists will do? They'll try to bury it because they're very dangerous people in this world who've listened to an atheist in the past, who've listened to a renowned atheist in the past. If the atheist comes out and tells them that God exists, what do you think those people will do to them? They spend their lives believing that God doesn't exist because of that atheist alone. Because of the words that, they believe the atheist so much that they actually listen to him. And now the atheist comes out and tells them that God exists. What do you think these dangerous people will do? They'll try to kill him. Why? Because that atheist ruined their lives. That atheist made them look like fools in front of others. So because of all these things, going to an atheist with proof that God, exists is going to an enemy's home and slapping them in the face. An atheist does not have, it's not in the best interest of an atheist to accept proof that God exists. It is not. Because many atheists, have already, they built many atheists build their reputation around the fact that they're atheists. They build their reputation based on that fact alone. And if proof ever comes out that they're idiots, that they're fools who jump to conclusion, who illogically started believing something that's impossible to prove, what do you think will happen to them? They'll be mocked and insulted. They'll be looked at as fools, idiots, liars, bullies, manipulators, gaslighters, thieves, scammers. This is the reputation that an atheist will get if they ever come out and say, yes, God exists. So do you think it's in their best interest to say God exists? Or don't you think it's better for them to just lie and deceive you that God doesn't exist, even when there's proof right in front of them? What do you think will happen? Because their reputation would be ruined, because their lives could be ruined. An atheist, it is better for an atheist to lie to you than tell the truth. It is more beneficial for an atheist to lie to you. Even when there's concrete proof that God exists, it is better for them to lie to you than tell you the truth. Because it could ruin their lives. It could ruin their reputation. It'll make them look like fools in front of others. It'll make them look like scammers in front of others. It'll make them look like thieves in front of others. Especially the atheists who make money from donations, There are a lot of atheists who have their own, platforms and make money from donations, and charities and all these things. If these guys, end up finding out that God exists, they'll try to bury that proof all day. Why? Because they can't make money from it anymore. Their reputation has been, the whole thing will ruin their reputation completely. So you have to be careful when dealing with atheists. Do not listen to someone who has a vested interest in lying to you. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why, even though it's so easy to prove that God exists, there's a reason why, even though it's so easy to prove that God exists, and it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist, why there's still atheists around. Because no matter what proof you bring, an atheist, is not inclined to believe you. Even if he does believe you, he's not inclined to say the truth. If he ever tells the truth, it makes him look like a fool. It makes him look like a scammer. So theologists could spend all day, all their lives proving that God exists with definite proof, and many atheists will not listen. You know why? Because, it'll make them look bad in front of others. It could ruin their lives. The moment they acknowledge that the truth is the truth, it could ruin their lives. So this is what you have to deal with in this world, is that not everyone is nice, and not everyone cares about the truth. The world of atheism, because you can't be an atheist, with logic. The world of atheism is filled with illogical people. And since it's filled with illogical people, they will never acknowledge that, the truth, no matter what, no matter how easy it is to prove that God exists, they will never listen to the truth. Because the truth hurts. And the truth will make them look bad in front of others. The truth will ruin their reputation. It can even get them killed. So this is what you have to deal with in this world. There's always a reason why someone is, is an atheist. And it's never because it's the truth, It's never because there's proof that God doesn't exist. Because how can you prove that God doesn't exist? How can you prove that something that exists doesn't exist? Think about it. How can you prove that something that exists doesn't exist? And that's the problem that atheists have. It is impossible for them to prove that that something that exists doesn't exist. It is impossible. Since it's impossible, they can only lie to you when truth comes. When the truth comes to their doorstep, they can only deny it and try to gaslight you into thinking it's a lie. Because the moment the truth, everyone acknowledges the truth, they will look bad in front of others. Their reputation will be ruined. Their lives could be ruined. So that's it for today's podcast episode. I'll talk to you guys later.